Good morning. Good morning. All right. Can we just talk this morning? I've got this technically a sermon, but I don't want it to come off just like this sermon that's being preached at. It's kind of, let's just talk this morning. Okay? It's Family Sunday, and as you heard, we've been talking a lot about our teens and about the children, and some of the verses they did, to look it up, the sword, whatever she called it. It kind of geared towards youth and the children. And I want to get our minds working a little bit this morning. I want us to start thinking a little bit. So I want to ask you a question. What are some words that come to your mind when you think about the youth? Not just teens, but children, teens in general. What are some words, and you don't have to answer out loud, you can just be thinking a little bit, and not just our teens, because they're wonderful all the time, and they don't do anything wrong, so they may not fit into the category of what you might think, you might think of the entire society of America. Okay, let's look at the society of America. When you hear about youth, what are some words that come to mind? What's that? Lost. I have a few words in my research when looking up what describes our youth today. We have rebellious, lazy, disrespectful, awkward, loud, naive, seeking identity, confused, and then lost. These are all words that have been used to describe the teens and the children of our society, of our time, and they all have a negative impact. All right. They all, when you hear those words, you immediately go to a negative thought. It's a negative description about the youth of today. And I know that we all can probably come up with some positive words. I'm sure maybe in your thoughts you had a few, the upbeat and positive, and they're energetic and they're fun. We can come up with a lot of those as well. But for the most part, this is what comes up in study and research, is these list of words. And so I want us to switch gears for just a moment. I want to look at a few statistics. I struggle to say that word, so the fact that I said it right makes me very happy. And these statistics, I have to say it slow every time, are mainly geared towards high school students, okay? And there's just a few that I'm going to go over. It says almost 50% of high school seniors have abused a drug of some kind. Over 60% of teens report that drugs of some kind are kept, sold, and used at their school. It says 58% of sophomores have abused alcohol, and 71% of seniors in high school have used alcohol. And then we have 15.8% of high school students have seriously considered suicide, as well as suicide is the third leading cause of death for people between the ages of 15 and 24. Those are some real heavy and serious statistics. Those are some things when you look at, and we go back and we look at some of these words that we use to describe the youth, and it's no wonder that they're lost. There's no shock that they are lost. There's no wonder that they are seeking identity and that they are confused. And yeah, these stats may not refer to our children. They may be looking geared towards the high school and your older teens, but it is important for us to know and to look so that we can do whatever it is that we need to do to prevent our children from becoming one of these statistics. It's a very alarming and very eye-opening thing to look at. And there's one thing, and looking at all these scriptures, one thing that really comes to mind, one word that I find that can tie all of this together, and that is purpose. And in this case, it is the lack of purpose. The lack of purpose that has been given to the youth today. And so I wanted to take a little bit of time this morning and look into the Bible. The Bible says that God's word is a lamp unto our feet and a light into our path. And so I wanted to take a little bit of time this morning. I wanted to look at what does the Bible say about youth. Okay, when we look into the Bible, there's many people, and it's one thing you'll never hear the youth know, the teens know, I do not like to say characters of the Bible. You will not hear me ever say, hey, let's look at the characters of the Bible, because when I hear characters, I immediately think of fictional stories. And these are not fictional stories. These are true stories about real people. So there's a people in the Bible, and when we are talking about youth or teens, there's a few that really jump out. I just want a quick mention. We have Joseph in the Old Testament, who was sold into slavery by his brothers at a very young age, and then taken off into Egypt. And then through God's empowerment and God's faithfulness to him, he was brought up into high position in Egypt. We have Mary, mother of Jesus. I mean, what more can we say about that, about God using a teen? God could have chosen any other person, chosen any other way, but yet he chose a teen, a mom, and Mary. And then we have Samuel, who was in bed at night, just asleep, and heard his name called out and didn't know what it was, didn't know who it was, went and asked what's going on, and 3 times God is calling him and letting him know that he is going to be something, he's going to do something great. But the first teen in the Bible I want us to really focus on is David. Okay? Now, my name is Micah David. Okay, my middle name is David. My dad's name is Ken David. My first son's name is Jace David. So it became apparent to me that David would be something of importance in my life to study. So I really like David. He's one of the few patriarchs that we actually see the span of most of his entire life. Okay? There's not a whole lot of that in the Bible, and David's one of those. So he's an important person. And so we're going to pick up with his story in 1 Samuel chapter 16. And this is during a time when God had told Samuel that Saul was not his anointed king. This is a time when God was saying, Saul is not going to be the king of my people. I need you to go to the house of Jesse, and for one of his sons has been chosen to be the next king of Israel. And so Samuel goes, and as soon as he approaches the property of Jesse, as soon as he approaches his home, he sees one of the sons. And he is a very strapping young man, very good in stature, good physical appearance, looks strong. And Samuel goes, that must be him. That has to be who God is talking about. And we go in verse 7 of 1 Samuel chapter 16, and it says, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." So God's saying, don't get caught up in what you see, okay? I've got somebody else in mind. And so he goes into goes to Jesse, and he says, okay, let me see your sons. And so he brings them out one by one. And one by one, God says, that's not him. That's not him. And in total, they go through 10 sons, all who would appear and seem to be very viable choices to be the next king of Israel. And Samuel's going, okay, God, you said it was here. I'm at the right place, right? I've gone through all of his sons. I've gone through all those sons he's brought to me, and you're saying, no, there's not one here. And so Samuel asked Jesse, Do you have any more? And Jesse, almost as if it was like an afterthought, he goes, well, yeah, there's one. And in verse 11, as we picked up, he asked Jesse, where are these all the sons you have? And Jesse says, yeah, he's out tending the sheep. Samuel said, well, send for him, for we will not sit down until he arrives. So he sent for him and had him brought in. He was glowing with health. He had a fine appearance and handsome features. The Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. At this point in David's life, this is before a lot of the stories that we've heard of David and Goliath and all this stuff. And David was still just a young teenager, or maybe in his middle years of being a teenager. And David is somebody that even his own father overlooked him because of his youth. His own father comes and says, oh yeah, he's just out tending the sheep. I don't know what the other 10 brothers had been doing at the time, but it was an afterthought. He was too young. He was too immature. He could not be the one that God was going to choose or God was going to use to be the next king. But God saw something more. He saw something different than the way that we look at the youth. The next team we're going to talk about is Daniel. Okay, Daniel was taken to captivity into Babylon probably when he was about the age of 12 or 13 years old. And at that time when Babylon was taking Jews and he's taking the captives, they weren't being captive just to be made slaves. Okay, when we think of Babylon and taking the Jewish out of their home, the Jews out of their home, we kind of think, okay, they're making them into slaves. And I'm sure there was some of that going on, but especially for the younger kids and youth, the goal and purpose was to train them up in the ways of the city of Babylon so that they would have a part of the Jewish culture integrated with them that could go and influence the rest of the Jewish culture. Okay, so at 12 or 13 years old, we have Daniel coming in, and he is being taught everything about their ways, all their rituals, all of the way they eat. And I can only imagine how difficult it would be as a teenager to withstand the temptation that was being offered. The city of Babylon had no moral code. Okay, there was no, this is bad for you because God says so. Anything was permissible. Go, have fun, enjoy the pleasures of our city. And so here we have Daniel, who stands up and opposes the king's ways and the king's orders. He opposes the temptation. And today, when a teen or a child, they mess up, they make a mistake, they do something wrong, they fall into temptation, our response can often be, it's okay. They're just teenagers. When they grow up, they'll be okay. We don't have to worry about them right now. And I can tell you from experience that as somebody who made a lot of poor decisions during my teenage years, and now being a pastor, I so wish I could go back to the teenage years. It was kind of a popular thing, especially in the 90s when I was in youth, that a youth pastor especially had to have a really cool backstory. Okay, that was like the cool things, like, hey, guess what I used to do as a teenager, and now God turned me into this. And it was almost something we would brag about. Okay, I can remember having the thought as a teenager, especially when I began to feel this call into ministry. I can remember actually thinking to myself, man, but I haven't done anything stupid yet. If I'm going to be a pastor, I got to have something stupid that I can talk about later on, because that's all I ever heard was, this is what I did. And so we sit here and look at the teens and say, it's okay. You make the mistake, no big deal. You're a teenager. You'll fix it when you get older. That's the way our society approaches youth when they make mistakes. And Daniel gives us the example and the knowledge that God can supply strength to avoid those temptations. And we see with Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 10:13, it says, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to mankind, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. So Pastor Dwayne was just talking about just a minute ago, we can run to Him as our shelter. He is our way out of temptation. And so it wasn't that He came upon Daniel and said, you know what, I am empowering you and you have no choice but to avoid sin and avoid temptation. But he gave him the empowerment and Daniel chose to accept it. Make that very clear. It's not something that God just did and said, you know what, I'm just going to protect you with this little bubble. Daniel chose to avoid that temptation. So God did not discredit Daniel and allow him to live in morality in Babylon just because he was young. He empowered him because he was young. Now the last group of teens that I want to talk about, we don't often look as teenagers. We often picture them as older men with big beards, okay? And that's how I've always pictured them up until several years ago when somebody kind of brought this picture to me. And that would be the disciples, okay? I want to talk to you about the disciples for just a minute. Our idea of the disciples is we picture, we see the pictures drawing of them with their old beards sitting with Jesus, and they're just older men. And I'm going to give you a few reasons why I don't believe the disciples to be much any older than 18 and definitely younger. Only one of the disciples was married, and that would be Peter. And in that culture, once you reached a certain age, an age of 18 to 19, typically you were then given a wife. You were then set to be married. And so with none of the other disciples being married, we can rest a little bit sure that the rest of the disciples were probably less than 18 years of age. We see in the book of Matthew, chapter 17, verses 24 through 27, a story where Jesus tells Peter to go and pay the census offering, okay, for the temple tax, okay? And so in those days, when Jesus and all the disciples were going into the temple and they had to pay the census, it was for men that were only 20 years or older, okay? So I understand it's 20 years or older, and it was half a shekel was the cost. The rest of the passage goes on and says that Jesus told Peter to go get find the shekel or find the money to pay for the census. Peter finds a shekel, 1 shekel in the mouth of a fish that he catches. And it says that shekel would have been enough to pay the census tax. So if only 1 shekel, we can do the math. I think it's pretty easy math. There, it's half a shekel for one person 20 and over, and another half a shekel for another person 20 and over. We have 2 people that are being paid for in this census at the temple. And so another way to look at the disciples being of younger age. Also in those days, the Jewish, once you were over 13, you were either chosen by a rabbi to continue study, to further your education. And then from that, the elite would then, at the age of 30, would begin their ministry. Hence the age we talk about Jesus being 30 years old when he began his ministry. If you were not in study with a rabbi, you went back home to work with your family. Okay? Whatever the family trade, you got thrown into the workforce. And we see all these people, all these disciples are in the workforce. Jesus comes to them and sees them at their place where they are work. They have no teacher. They have no furthering education. Jesus comes in and finds them where they are. And one thing I think is so cool about that is Jesus is picking these disciples who have already been unpicked. His disciples, just a cool little whole message of the way Jesus' ministry really worked, was going and choosing the ones that were unchosen, choosing the ones that were already overlooked. And then, what about that? The way we talk about some of their language, some of the things it's written about, I can't picture older men, disciples in the boat when the boat was rocking and shaking and the storm's coming about. Can you picture these older grown men running down to Jesus, trying to shake him and wake him up and saying, "We're scared, we're scared"? I picture more teenagers kind of being more scared of that storm. We may have a few adult men that might fall in that category. Or when John writes about going to the tomb to see the empty tomb, and that's my favorite passage to laugh at. Because John always writes, and John got there first in a foot race. And he brings up again, and by the way, the one that got there first, that was me, by the way. It's a teenager talking. Now we have some men here again that could fall into that. Our softball team, I think we try to one-up each other every so often. So we might have that little bit mentality ourselves as well. But I picture these as teenagers. Okay? These disciples were not these seasoned men of faith. They were not these guys that had been through life. They were teenagers that God picked. God chose to build his church on the youth. He chose to give them purpose. He entrusted the future of the church to the youth of the day. And my question is, why don't we? Why do we look at children and teens and say that maybe in our minds we're not using the language, but some part of us is saying they're a little bit substandard to the overall need to be involved in church? We'll go back to the very beginning of the message. We labeled these students, we labeled the youth, we labeled children with all these descriptive words of negativity. And one thing that stands out through all of these passages, these people that we have talked about, is they all were given and all had purpose. David was given purpose. Even though, again, overlooked by his father, overlooked by everybody else, he was given purpose to be in God's story, to lead God's people. Daniel was given purpose to rise above what the Babylonians wanted him to do, to be an example to the rest of the Jewish culture that we can overcome these temptations. And the disciples were given purpose to, even after Jesus was crucified and resurrected, they went, they hid, they were scared, but then when Jesus came to them, he empowered them. And boy, did they get on fire and go and spread his message. Today, we give our students an excuse to be lazy, not needed, irresponsible. We want you, teens, we always say, we want you to be happy. We want you to be able to do everything you want to do. If it makes you unhappy, then we won't worry about doing it. And so we give them this excuse to be lazy. The church can oftentimes fall into this pattern or fall into this pit of saying, well, we've got a children's pastor. We've got a youth pastor. They've got their volunteers. So I'm not responsible or I'm not needed. Okay? We can sit down and go, you know what? I can tell you, I can probably speak for Pastor Michelle, I know I can speak for myself, that you see a student in this church, especially, and if they're doing something that's not right, they're doing something that doesn't seem appropriate, maybe it's just seems off. Maybe that you look at it and it's like, you know what, something is just off. I'm not going to be upset if you approach them. I mean, I've had times before where somebody will come up to April or myself, and it will be mainly April. They will come up and it'll be like, hey, one of the teens was doing something over there. Like, did you ask them to stop? No. I'm not talking to them. They're scary. I can't say nothing. Guys, I was 13 years old with a beard. Everybody at my church said something to me, okay? And I was as scary as a teen as they came. But we all, any of us that grew up in church, and there's a few that I've known since my early 20s, and I was in youth with and on this district with, a few that grew up in this church, and we had mamas and daddies everywhere throughout the entire church. It wasn't just my mom and dad sitting on the side, on the back row or the side row, wherever they sat. There was moms and dads everywhere. You turn the corner, you did something wrong. You need to watch yourself. Now, there's a right way and a wrong way. I've experienced where an older gentleman one time, a young teen, walked into the sanctuary/gym, kind of like we have. And we're a decently casual church. And this church wasn't as casual. He walked in with a baseball cap on, and it was a Sunday morning. An older gentleman in the church came in and just grabbed the hat and took it right off and made a spectacle of the situation. I can tell you in the time that I was continuing to go to that church, that teenager never came back to church. If you want to approach them, we are responsible for these teens. We're responsible for their lives when they walk in this door. You can go to that same teen and say, hey, what's your name? How you been? Well, can I tell you, it's a little disrespectful to have the hat on inside here on a Sunday morning. Do you mind taking it off? You accomplish the same thing. You get the hat off the kid's head. But one way was done with love. One way was done that kind of pushes them away. So the truth is, even if you're sitting here today saying, oh, I forgot it was Family Sunday. They're going to preach about teens and kids. And I don't have it anymore. And I could have slept in. I could have gone to Cracker Barrel for breakfast. You have all these things. You sit there and say, this doesn't apply to me. Well, the truth is, this entire message, this entire lesson applies to each and every one of you, because if you're an adult in this room, you are responsible. Matthew 18, verse 2 through 6. The kids looked up the first part of it. It says, he called a little child to him and placed the child among them. He said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. That's to all of us. If we claim the name of Jesus, if we claim that relationship, we are responsible to these little ones, to these teens. We are responsible to be examples. We are responsible to show love. We are responsible to be involved and be a part of their life in some way, shape, or form. You may say, I'm not the best at talking to teens. You don't have to come up and talk and have conversation with them all day long. But what are you doing to show responsibility? How are you helping them move through their life and grow in Christ? As the worship band comes back up to close us in song, I have a charge that I want to give to the church, to the adults, not just parents, because as we just described, we all have responsibility. I want to give us a little bit of a charge of information that we can take with us from this place and maybe change our perspective about the youth. I ask you, do not look down on them. Do not see them as loud and useless. Do not handcuff them and allow them to sit idle and alone. Meaning, do not just cast them to the side and say, you have no purpose or worth. Build them up. Give them the tools to achieve. Be there to support them. Most important, help them find purpose in God. And then to the youth and to the students, they're not just substandard citizens of society. They are not just substandard citizens of God's people, of God's family. They are not just substandard citizens of our church. They have more to offer. These are words from a judge that posted into an article in a newspaper. He worked often with teens, and a question he would always hear from teenagers is, what can we do or where can we go? And this is his reply that he put into the newspaper. He says, my answer is this: go home, mow the lawn, wash the windows, learn to cook, build a raft, get a job, and after you've finished, read a book. Your town does not owe you recreational facilities, and your parents do not owe you fun. The world does not owe you a living. You owe the world something. You owe it your time, energy, and talent, so that no one will be at war and sickness and lonely again. In other words, grow up. Stop being a crybaby. Get out of your dream world and develop a backbone, not a wishbone. Start behaving like a responsible person. And this is the part I want you to hear. You are important. You are needed. It's too late to sit around and wait for somebody to do something someday. Someday is now, and that somebody is you. Our teens matter to society. They matter to our church. And we'll close with 1 Timothy 4:12. Do not let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. As we close, our teens, our children matter. Don't let anybody look down on you guys. And adults, don't let anybody look down on them. We're responsible to each other as well. Do you love the children? Do you love the teens? And how do you show that? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you that we are all part of your plan and your purpose. As we've said this morning, your kingdom has no age limit. Your purpose on our life has no age limit. There is nobody that is too young to be used for your glory and to spread your word. As we heard this morning about children quizzing and the relationship that they're building with you through that, the knowledge that they are gaining and the ability that they have through that activity, through that ministry, through that form of worship to be able to spread the truth about who you are. God, may we as adults not just cast aside the youth, but may we, through your empowerment, be able to strengthen them and lead them and guide them to fulfill your purpose and your plan in their life. We thank you for your son, Jesus. We thank you for his love and his mercy that is bestowed upon us each and every day. It's in your name we pray. Amen.